Well, I want to continue forward in this discussion. I know you're hearing from people who study this, who are looking at it both historically and sometimes looking at it from just a purely legal perspective. But as we continue to move forward, our next conversation is going to be with somebody who really does understand how this affects us as it relates to law and religion, and specifically within our court system in America. Well, I'm excited to have with us our next guest, Kristen Waggoner. She serves as general counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom. And most important, this is an organization that over the last several years has won 9 different Supreme Court cases around these topics of religious freedom. And where does it come in that the government's infringing on that? And how do we protect freedom of conscience and those types of rights for American citizens? And so we're going to ask her perspective, and how do we look at this constitutionally? How do we look at it from this perspective of law? And so, Kristen, welcome to talk with us about constitutional rights today. I think for most pastors right now, the challenge is this is the first time as a pastor, as a church leader, that they've been told by the government, in some cases more restrictive than others, they've been told, we need you to stop meeting. We need you on Sunday mornings to close the doors, whether that was earlier in the spring or some still in that case today. And it's the first time that they're hearing that. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how pastors might be receiving that kind of information?
Well, I think initially it was just shock. It is unprecedented in our lifetime to have something happen like this. At our organization alone, just since March, we've received and advised over 3,000 religious organizations on their advice during this time, which shows you the level of concern that different organizations and churches are facing, not just in terms of what's happening at their states, but also at the local level. There's a lot of confusion. So when we first started getting these calls in March and April, we always want to operate with the spirit of cooperation and collaboration with government officials. That's usually the better way to go, and certainly most churches wanted to do that as well. We would go to government officials and say, hey, excuse me, there are certain limits to your authority here. Let's talk about what those limits are. And because most government officials are well-intentioned, they would simply change their orders, and they would work with these churches, realizing the benefit that they provide to the communities on so many levels. But I think now we're 6 months into this almost, and the situation has changed. The facts on the ground are changing, and we're growing more and more concerned that the notion that we will love our neighbor and we will collaborate is maybe misunderstood to suggest that the right of free exercise is one of convenience or luxury, and we're not recognizing as a society the impact of closing the church, both spiritually, physically, emotionally on our communities, but also long-term what the right of religious freedom gives us in our society, because it expands much further than just securing the right to be able to express our faith. But even we know civil liberties travel together, so this kind of unprecedented restriction, if it continues, will, I think, cause even broader concerns and problems in our nation.
Yeah, well, thank you for that explanation. And just to ask for even more detail here as we talk about constitutional rights, where is it that you see the rights of the government? Where is the line drawn between what they should be able to ask and order or restrict a church to do, and where that line stops in the type of republic that we exist in?
Well, we have to go back to first principles, and I think you've already expressed an intent to do that with some of your other speakers. But at ADF, one of the things that we talk about is our First Amendment rights aren't just constitutionally guaranteed, they're actually God-given. They're inalienable rights, they're apolitical, they weren't created by the United States of America. But what has been unique to our nation is our vigilance in protecting free speech, free assembly, and free exercise. And what has been unique is our insistence that the Constitution places limits on government officials. So I think the natural next question is, well, what are those limits in this time period? And I think the Supreme Court has affirmed a few principles again and again. And the first is a principle that the government can't act in a hostile manner towards people of faith or towards religious organizations. Most recently, we've seen the Supreme Court affirm that principle in a case called Trinity Lutheran, which was an ADF case involving a church and its participation in a benefit program that Missouri was providing. And then in the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision, which involved a cake artist, and the government of Colorado was acting with hostility hostility towards him because of his religious faith. So that's a basic principle that applies here. The government can't target people of faith or churches because of their religion or their beliefs. A second principle is also important, which is the government can't treat churches worse than other similarly situated actors, whether it's it can't pick winners and losers when it comes to who is able to open and who is able to close in an arbitrary manner.
Yeah, and I think that's been the case that we've seen so much about in Nevada, where the Supreme Court pushed back on that, where casinos were able to open at 50% capacity, but yet the church was not allowed to have more than 50 people. Why do you think the Supreme Court ruled in that way? Because that did seem like that didn't align with what you just stated.
Well, I tell you, that was an ADF case, and we were just heartsick by the court's decision in that case. But I do think there's some important things that most people don't know about the case. First of all, is it didn't set precedent. It went up to the court on what's called an emergency application for an injunction. Most cases take years to get to the Supreme Court, but that's a measure you can get it there quicker. But in order for the court to agree to even hear the case, to decide it or to intervene, you have to prove exigent circumstances, which is the highest bar you could possibly have to meet. So the court simply denied hearing the case. It didn't issue a decision saying that what Nevada was doing was permissible. A second thing to know about that case is that 4 of the justices, and there are 9 on the Supreme Court, so it was a 5-4 vote as to whether to hear the case. 4 of those justices vehemently disagreed. And as Justice Gorsuch wrote in his dissenting opinion, he said that certainly in our world we're facing unusual challenges, but there is no world in which the Constitution allows Caesar's Palace to be open while Calvary Chapel is closed. And they did set a roadmap, I think, for that case to continue and go back up to the U.S. Supreme Court in the near future.
Yeah, and I'm sure you see the concern, but I wonder how real it is. I think some people assume that there's a conspiracy underway to shut down American churches. Others say that's crazy, like we're just making too much of it. You sit in this space all the time of trying to understand legal threats and how precedent is actually set. I think one of the concerns is in the future, let's say we've moved beyond this particular pandemic, but are we in a situation where when a state deems something a threat, even if it's not completely adding up, even if as we get the information, it's not necessarily making sense to the leader of that particular church, are we in a position where the state really is starting to have more of a right to come in and tell churches what to do?
Well, they don't have the right, but they are in some states and local municipalities trying to exert a right that they shouldn't have under the Constitution. And so we are deeply concerned. But what's important in these matters is that we act with wisdom and discretion, that we think about the tone in which we're advocating. And there's a saying in the law that bad facts make bad law. So we don't want to have a bunch of churches engaging in civil disobedience regardless of the facts without taking precautions and just filing a lawsuit. That's not the right way to go about this. But one other point, Gabe, that I think is worth noting for the season that we're in is that those courts that are ruling against churches in this way are largely relying on a Supreme Court decision called Jacobson. But Jacobson was a decision that actually was handed down in 1905, 100 years ago. It was involving a $5 penalty for someone who didn't want to get the smallpox vaccine. It wasn't even a free exercise case. It wasn't even a First Amendment case. It was what's called a substantive due process case. So the precedent and its applicability here is very questionable. Yeah. But more importantly, what it shows is we are still living by and suffering from decisions that were made 100 years ago in our court system, which is why this season is important, and it's important for us to stand now, knowing future generations will also reap the benefit or the burden of how we act in this time period.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that whatever decisions we're making now, whatever legal precedents are being set, do establish the way in which maybe law will be defined in the future. And I'm curious, for those pastors who are listening and going, I feel like I need to stand against, I need to file a lawsuit, or I need to just open, regardless of what my local government is saying, because I feel in my conviction that that is what I'm called to do as a pastor. Describe maybe what is the legal risk that's happening as a church moves forward into this space? What are some of the risks that they're opening themselves up to? Are they opening their congregation up to also some sort of fines and risk? How should we think about that?
Right. Well, I do believe, and I know the scripture can be overused, that we're not to operate in a spirit of fear. But there's also words in the scripture that talk about exercising wisdom and the wisdom of many counselors. And so what we have advised churches to do is to pray, to think carefully about what God would call them to do here, to recognize that there are civil and criminal liabilities that will play. It depends on the jurisdiction and the particular executive order, what they're trying to impose as a penalty. There could also potentially be civil liability if a COVID outbreak happened in the church and the church didn't take reasonable measures. And so we encourage churches to consult legal counsel before they take that move to open back up. There are also all kinds of helpful guidelines online about what a reasonable opening would look like in terms of safety standards. Churches should be following those. They can reach out to ADF and talk to our attorneys or join the Church and Ministry Alliance. But I also want to underscore this because this is something we've really seen a lot of in terms of how these things play out. Churches that have strong relationships with their local government officials tend to be able to navigate these situations much more effectively. And churches that don't have those types of relationships are struggling more. So I think it underscores the importance of religious organizations and churches developing relationships that are healthy and positive and collaborative before the pandemic, and certainly now moving forward. And lastly, I'll just say this. I sure think this is a lesson in civics. It matters who we vote for. And I'm not getting into presidential politics. I'm saying it matters the mayor. The mayor matters. We literally saw a mayor impose $500 fines on a church for a drive-through service. So that matters. And I don't see anywhere in Scripture where passivity or fatalism plays a role in how the Christian should engage in civil government or in his community.
Well, Kristen, we just thank you for bringing your insight, your experience, and expertise to so many leaders in our country right now who are looking for that, who are trying to better understand what's at stake, what is the real threat or perceived threat, and how do we move forward? How do we move forward with wisdom? And so I appreciate you just taking the time to help us get insight into that.
Well, we're so thankful for all you do as well.
Thank you. So as we continue forward in this conversation, I think Kristen makes a great point that this is a giant civics lesson. And for those of you who didn't think elections mattered, or you're in a position where you didn't quite understand how do counties operate inside of an expansion of little towns and cities and mayors, and how do all these things work together, we're getting a giant lesson in that. And I think her point that we need to be engaging in relationship before we come into a crisis moment is critical. And when we build relationships in the cities, so many of you that have partnered with Q to be a part of our efforts to start to convene and gather leaders in your city, to be on the same page, to be a united front prior to crisis coming, you're in a stronger place now to be able to act and to be able to have relationships where you can actually have reasonable discourse and conversation so it doesn't come to a lawsuit.